Hello and welcome to lesson 4 of the topic of changing cities. Before we get into the lesson, I'm just going to introduce some of the key terms you're going to be faced with through some dingbats. So like all dingbats, I'll just pause the screen, or you pause the screen. I will pause for about 2 seconds before I reveal the answer. Okay, so the first one. This is urbanisation. Herb, ban, eyes, hay, shin. Okay, the next 3 are going to be very easy, hopefully. This is suburbanisation. This one is counter-urbanisation. And this one is re-urbanisation. Now those 4 terms, urbanisation, suburbanisation, counter-urbanisation and re-urbanisation, are going to involve the first activity we're going to cover. There are 2 more dingbats though, which form the second part of the session. Right, this is national migration. So that's Nasha, Dennis the Menace's dog, and that's nil-nil. So divide by 2 is just nil, Nasha nil. That's a Mai Tai cocktail, minus the tie is just Mai. That's George Clooney, who's famous for having grey hair, and that's Mr. Sheen. So national Mai Grey Sheen. And this, if you know your Italian football teams, is international migration. Okay, so the title for today is Urbanisation and Migration in Norwich. It's quite a long session, and we're going to try and sort of divide up the 2 parts. So we're going to look at urbanisation first, and we're going to look at more specifically the 4 processes of urbanisation. So urbanisation, suburbanisation, counter-urbanisation and re-urbanisation in the context of Norwich. We're then going to look at migration in Norwich, so both national and international migration. We're going to look at why or where that's kind of happening, and we're going to look at some of the ways in which it's affected Norwich, so the impacts. The last part of this session is going to be looking at an 8-mark exam question, so you can practice and apply your knowledge of impacts of migration on Norwich to a kind of exam scenario. Okay, so this first activity, you need to get onto 365 to download this sheet. And what I need you to do in this case is organise your page into 4 headings and do it in this order. Urbanisation for a quarter of 1, suburbanisation, counter-urbanisation and then re-urbanisation. Now each of these different sections on the handout needs to be matched to another. So the white boxes they're definitions that belong to one of those 4 headings. Each picture, so circular picture with the arrows and stuff, that belongs to one of the headings as well. And each black box is a Norwich-based example of that process as well. So they belong one each heading. So you're putting a white box with a picture and a black box all together. So once you've done that, okay, try and cut them out and order them, but don't stick them down. When you're ready, unpause the screen. It should take you around 10 to 15 minutes to do, and I will go through the answers after I've paused myself in about 5 seconds. But for you, like I say, just pause the screen until you're completed. Okay, so the answers. Urbanisation first. That is the increase in percentage of people living in towns and cities, causing those places to begin growing outwards. So that one is because people are moving from rural areas into the city centre. Okay, so the green areas that are rural, the movement of people as arrows into the red zone, which is the city centre or inner city. So this diagram goes with this definition. And in Norwich, just like many places in the United Kingdom and the developed world, that occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries as a result of the development of manufacturing. And in Norwich, that was specifically textiles and shoes. So then suburbanisation occurs. Now, as the people move into the town centres and city centres, more and more people arrive, which means that they need to live somewhere. And that causes the growth of what we call the suburbs. So those people that move to the town centres, the city centres and the terraced houses, more and more arrive, which means they need to have more space outside of that area. And so the suburbs start to develop. So that's this diagram. Now that is the outward spread of houses and buildings further from the city centre. This area grows outwards from the centre as more people arrive. And in Norwich, that was something that occurred during the 20s and 30s. So the areas of Marcross and Lakenham that we see today were the initial development of the suburban area of Norwich. So the third section, or the third thing, counter-urbanisation, is actually where the suburbs develop so much that people industry, so the white arrow, moves away from the city centre, because actually a lot of the industry, the manufacturing, needs lorries and trucks and big roads and lots of space, and there isn't the space because the city's just enveloping, or the suburbs are going around and growing around the city, so they move outside the city limits themselves to be nearer kind of main roads and good transport networks. The other thing that happens is the original housing, the terraces and the pretty old housing by this stage, has become almost slum-like, and so that gets knocked down. The people that were living there have to be relocated, or they relocate elsewhere outside the city centre while it's being redeveloped. So this is called counter-urbanisation. It's the movement of people away from smaller settlements and into rural areas. Away from the cities into smaller settlements and rural areas located beyond the city. Now that happened during the 60s and 70s as a result of maybe massive slum areas in Norwich because of maybe Nazi raids of 1942, and also kind of just the older housing like in Richmond and Higham Grove areas. They demolished it and they built newer houses in those areas. So the final section is re-urbanisation, and we're going to come into a bit more detail on that in a second. Re-urbanisation is the movement of people back towards the city centre, away from the rural areas and suburbs. And so that's this diagram here. So people have now, rather than kind of going out like in counter-urbanisation, certainly people are moving back towards the city centre into redeveloped and regenerated houses and industrial areas. So that has sort of been occurring in Norwich since the 90s at least, because of things like Chapelfield and Riverside, and King Street redevelopment, and new plush kind of apartments being built around the Riverside area. So we're going to get a few more notes on this concept of re-urbanisation. So once you've stuck those down, feel free to move on to the next slide, and we're going to get some notes on that. So this is just some images to show you Norwich, and you won't recognise this very much because actually it doesn't look anything like this now. But this is Carrow Road, and if you know where Carrow Road is, the Holy Grail of football, obviously. This area, the South Stand's been redeveloped, but more importantly, all of this area on the Riverside front is completely like chock-a-block with high-rise flats now, and they're really quite posh flats. The penthouses go for over £1 million in some cases, and all along King Street as well, it's been redeveloped and lots of housing's been kind of improved. But here as well, they've developed industry. So you've got things like the Nike store, and there's a leisure centre here, big multi-storey car park here. You've got Morrison's and other shops and retail outlets, as well as the entertainment quarter, which this pixelated image shows you. You've got Frankie and Benny's and the cinema just around the corner and the bowling alley and stuff like that. So this is what we call regeneration, or urban regeneration, which makes older downtrodden derelict areas, brownfield sites, turns them into sort of places that people maybe want to go. Now admittedly these houses aren't in Norwich, but this is very similar to what happened in King Street. Very derelict old properties that look very run down, but boarded up windows, all sorts of single glazed sash windows, have been redeveloped to look really, really lovely, and they're energy efficient and they're really posh, and they're worth a lot more money now. And so young professionals tend to kind of move to these areas for this housing, but they also move to these areas for the entertainment facilities that are there. If I sneeze, by the way, please just sort of cover your ears. I'm sorry. I can feel one tickling my nose. So you need to get these notes down about re-urbanisation. It's the movement of people back into urban areas. We've already got that definition, but the reasons are because of in-movement of wealthy and often young professional people into that redeveloped older housing. And that's a process known as gentrification. And then lastly, we also get those people moving in because of facilities like the Riverside development and Chapelfield, which built both houses and also entertainment facilities, which attract sort of generally the younger professional generation. So make sure you get those two notes written down. If you've done that really quickly, if you want to recap a bit of push and pull factors stuff from a couple of lessons ago, then please feel free to try and identify push and pull factors associated with re-urbanisation. So if you've not got those notes down, pause the screen until you have, and then when you're ready you can move on. So now we're going to move on to the sort of second portion of the lesson, which is looking at the concept of migration. So just to give you a definition of migration, it's there in sort of a funny Bradley Hand ICT format. Migration is the movement of people from one place to another. That's it. Now it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be migration from a different country to another. That is migration, that's international migration, but you also get national migration, which is movement within a city. So you've got, if I moved from Norwich to London, I have still migrated because I've moved from one place to another. Now in Norwich, we have a variety of places that our migrants come from, and we also have different impacts that migration has on Norwich. So I'm going to show you, and what I'd like you to do, please, after you've written that definition down, is to get the handouts that are on 365, which are all Norwich specific diagrams about migration. So this map is not included on that. This is just the national picture of migration. It's quite old, between 2004 and 2007, and it shows you the darker areas are where more migrant workers arrived in those sort of 3 to 4 year period. Now Norwich itself, you can see they're sticking out in the hump of East Anglia, hasn't had major migration, but it still has had its share of migrants. Most